Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me live on Shaka Extra Time is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kavale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Well, despite some of the social things that I don't feel very free to talk about, I honestly think that I am terrific.
Great, yeah. A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to interact with Shaka himself. And in a few minutes, I will be taking your questions. Shaka, let's maybe start with what's been going on. Last week was a tsunami of news from the continent. Maybe we can start with the death of long-time Zimbabwean opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai, who succumbed to cancer. He was buried today. Your thoughts?
It's most unfortunate, Paul, because I knew to some degree Morgan Richard Tsvangirai. A man, frankly, I would say was arguably the most effective opposition political leader in Zimbabwe since independence in 1980. I had the occasion to have him on Straight Talk Africa a couple of times. I remember one time, in fact, we got him in Harare. If I remember correctly, he was actually having sanctuary in the embassy of Holland. And this is when, of course, the government really was moving against the opposition, because the opposition seemed to be very, very effective. This is about after the election of 2008, which a lot of observers, in fact, said he might, in fact, have won it, have had the mathematics to be the new president of Zimbabwe in round one. Remember, the results took 1 month in order to be announced by officials, really. So one would wonder, what were they doing in that 1 month, sincerely, of counting votes? I mean, these are a couple of million people that go to vote. Some people say, of course, the government was doing a bit of in their words, not mine, creative accounting. Even then, of course, he ended up beating President Robert Gabriel Mugabe in the first round. And you know what happened in the second round? It became a political military operation. They were just beating left and right all the supporters who came to listen to Tsvangirai. And Tsvangirai had no choice but to pull out of the second round, which obviously ended up having Robert Gabriel Mugabe running against Robert Gabriel Mugabe. And that's how you ended up having a government of national unity, in which Tsvangirai got the opportunity to participate as a prime minister, but a prime minister, frankly, with the title, but no authority. In fact, some of the generals, including Valentin Chiwenga, could not even salute the prime minister. But it's amazing how things, can change sometimes, because right now, the current president, Emerson Mnangagwa, frankly, seems to be reaching out to Tsvangirai and his political party. They even actually gave a military helicopter to carry the body of Morgan Tsvangirai to his ancestral land, where he was expected to be buried, and he probably has already been buried as we talk.
I'm just curious why, when you look at the kind of politics or the level at which he played his game, he was not an ordinary kind of guy. He had risen to the ranks of those people you could quote and call maybe, he had gotten to a point whereby he would be considered a statesman. I wonder why maybe the current government didn't give him a burial that befits a person of his stature.
I don't know. In fact, they should have taken advantage of that, especially given that they have elections actually coming around the corner. This obviously was a man that they did not particularly like, because he seemed to have an upper hand in terms of mobilizing and sensitizing a lot of people, especially in major urban areas. Mind you, this was a man who didn't go to school very much. He finished what they call O-levels, basically secondary school, and then left and went into the real world to work. He ended up being a trade unionist and a very effective mobilizer. And despite the fact that Robert Gabriel Mugabe had actually earned 7 university degrees, arguably one of the most educated individuals to hold that kind of office in the world. When you look at his policies, you look at the manner in which he governed, especially after 2000, there is no question that Morgan Tsvangirai was probably the kind of champion. Some have in fact called him a general that advocated social economic justice for all Zimbabweans. But of course he never had the opportunity to rule, so we'll never know how good or bad he could have ended up as a statesman, as you say. But, let's face it, I think it is very unfortunate that he dies at the younger age of 65. 65, and he dies. And guess what? His major opponent, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, at about probably 94 now, about that, this month later, he's still alive.
How about those? How would you respond to those critics who said that when he had an opportunity to test power, a little bit of power, when they had that coalition government, he actually did not carry himself as the quote-unquote the kind of guy that you just described, a person who fought for social justice, who fought for equality for all, but rather one of those other politicians who cared about himself and his immediate colonies around him.
Those, there might be some truth in that, but probably those were probably appearances really, because let's face it, earlier I told you, this was a man, when he became prime minister, yes, he had a title of the Right Honorable Prime Minister. He had a position, but the question is, did he in fact have authority to practice power? I don't think he had. He was simply subordinate to the president, who was the head of government, head of state, commander-in-chief of the armed forces and the police and what have you. This man did not really have the ability to make a difference in terms of, for example, influencing what kind of budget and where it was allocated. He was given some ministries, except that, of course, one of the most important ministry was Ministry of Finance. I remember Tendai Biti was Minister of Finance from MDC, but most very important strategic positions were basically ZANU-PF under President Robert Mugabe. So yes, again, he had the title, he had a position, and the kind of pomp and pageantry that you would associate with that office, but he simply did not have the power to deliver in terms of social delivery and what have you. He did not have power to move mountains. No, he didn't.
Okay, let's go to a comment, a follow-up comment from Dwayne Joseph in Abuja, Nigeria. He says, with the death of Morgan Tsvangirai, how is the opposition going to cope up? How can the opposition deliver at the end of the day? Because from his perspective, they don't seem to be united.
As a matter of fact, he was the kind of individual who could have symbolized perhaps the bridging of the gaps between various factions that formed the originally MDC, because the MDC is split as we talk in about 3 factions and what have you. And since he has died, I have also seen that even within his main faction, which is MDC Tsvangirai, in fact, there are some major differences of opinion as regards to who, in fact, is the legitimate successor of Mr. Tsvangirai. And so it's quite possible that the opposition is split, and the government will probably feel better. It can take advantage of those splits. But I have also heard that to a certain degree, the ZANU-PF also may in fact be split, because there are those people who were characterized as people who supported Dr. Grace Mugabe, who under what they call the G40, they seem to have in fact had a meeting with the political party led by Joyce Mujuru, Dr. Joyce Mujuru, a former, of course, vice president who had been dismissed by Robert Mugabe. But apparently they met up with Mugabe and Dr. Grace and made up, and it looks like there might in fact be some kind of coalition coming between those two people, so that they can make it very difficult for the crocodile, Emerson Mnangagwa, to win the whole thing in the first round, because Zimbabwe, of course, requires that in order to win the presidency, you must be, you must, cross the threshold of 50 plus 1 vote. And so it remains to be seen, really, how the opposition groups can be effective, and whether, in fact, they are ready for prime time.
Interesting. Yeah, in politics, there is no script that one can follow. Let's cross over to Ethiopia.
That's, of course, why they say that in politics, they are neither permanent allies nor permanent adversaries. They are merely permanent interests. And so, when the interests change, the alliances naturally keep shifting.
Interesting. Let's cross over to Ethiopia. Remarkable developments in Ethiopia. All of a sudden, the Prime Minister resigns, and now we have a power vacuum, a crisis of some sort. They declared a state of emergency. Interesting stuff out in Ethiopia as a result of, quote-unquote, what they characterized as the ongoing political situation, especially in the Amhara and Oromia regions. Your thoughts, Shaka?
Very interesting, of course, as you say, and yes, it was interesting that Haile Mariam Desalegn, if in fact that is the correct way of pronouncing the names, he had the courage, essentially, to make an important decision, because he was also the chairman of the ruling party, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. And that is the extent to which, of course, it can actually even make claims to being a democracy. Because the last time I checked, my friend, out of hundreds of lawmakers in Ethiopia, there is only one lawmaker representing what they call the opposition.
The rest are in jail.
The rest, well, they have been releasing them as a result, obviously, of the uprisings of the younger people among the areas that you mentioned, the Oromos and the Amhara. And frankly, you look at Ethiopia, it needs socio-economic political reforms. And apparently, from what we gather, Mr. Haile Mariam was able to tender his resignation precisely because he felt that he could no longer influence essentially what he thought was very badly needed in the context of Ethiopia. He needed fundamental reforms. They needed to essentially open up the political space, really, so other elements, because let's face it, Ethiopia has been doing well economically in terms of statistics. It has been actually growing around, double digits. But the fact of the matter is those are statistics poor, because those statistics do not necessarily reflect in people's stomachs. They do not reflect in people's neighborhoods, really. But they are there, and yet they have, of course, an increasingly young population, which is pretty much in a position of not, which has nothing major to do. They have no jobs. They feel like they are politically and socially, economically marginalized. And they want their voice to be heard. And these are the young people, who happen because of their age, and you were at that stage at one time, when you are that young as they are, you have nothing to lose, but perhaps your chains. You feel like you have everything to gain. And they are not going to stop pressuring the system. And so, given that the Oromo population, which is almost like a third of the Ethiopian population, when you add on the Amhara, they pretty much like in the neighborhood of 60 million people.
Absolutely.
And yet the Tigray are about 90% of the population. These are the people that actually hold power, which they seized back in 1991 using AK-47. And perhaps the reason that they decided to declare a state of emergency or martial law and what have you is because the generals, the senior military security officials, happen to come from that particular group, the Tigray, which is in the north, neighboring Eritrea and all that kind of stuff. But you know what? I think eventually they have to make concessions, because let's face it, Ethiopia is the second largest, country in terms of population after Nigeria. They have more than 100 million people, and most of those increasingly are very young. They have no jobs, they have no nothing, so they're going to have to pressure to the extent that their voice has to be heard. And so maybe they may actually end up accepting the resignation, of course, of Haile Mariam Desalegn, who we hear may in fact have been forced out, really, and bring in somebody probably who comes from the Oromos, really. The Oromos have never ruled Ethiopia, and yet they are the majority. As we talk, of course, it may be very interesting politically, because even the president, who happens to be very ceremonial, obviously supposed to be commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which he does not control at all, and happens to be the head of state, but frankly, pretty much in terms of pageantry and pomp. But in terms of having the power, the real power, he doesn't have. But can it actually be done politically to have two individuals seemingly in top positions coming from the same community? Maybe yes, maybe not. And if not, maybe they have to go back to the Amhara, who used to be traditionally the ones that called the shots in Ethiopia. I cannot see them bringing someone from Tigray really in front as a prime minister, because I think they will not control or contain the situation.
Let's move along, Shaka. Let's now go to another Facebook comment. Let's go to LM Perezo. He says, Shaka, is President Jacob Zuma's resignation and the coming of President Ramaphosa bring any hope to the people of South Africa?
Well, I think so. I think these are great opportunities, especially when you look at the fact that here was democracy at work. It's probably one of the few countries, if not the only one, where you can have those types of peaceful democratic transitions. With exception, perhaps another country might actually be Mauritius. But South Africa is very, very significant because it has a very huge population. It has more than 50 million people. It is the most industrialized nation on the African continent. At one time, in fact, it had a nuclear bomb, especially during apartheid and all that kind of stuff. For it to change the president in a manner that they did, in a peaceful, democratic manner, in a situation where a political party, the ANC, can actually have the powers to recall one of theirs from what they call deployment, and it happens, is very, very significant, because I don't see again where else it could happen really, because north of the border, across the Limpopo, in Zimbabwe, they talk about the change didn't come about through a military coup. Well, I am not a lawyer. Maybe, of course, you could say it did not come through a de jure military coup, so to speak, but let's face it, de facto. It was a de facto military coup. But you also have, of course, to give them credit because they behaved incredibly, they had incredible behavior. They did not, there was no looting, there was no much violence that you could talk about. Everything seemed to be very, very peaceful. But then again, they were the same people, really. We all came from the Shona, the Kalanga, the Zulu, and all that kind of stuff. They were pretty much the same people. So they were able to pull it off. But South Africa is very interesting, and we hope that it could actually have lessons for the rest of the African continent.
Speaking of lessons, let's do a quick follow-up from Dauda Semamba in Johannesburg, South Africa. He says, can MPs in Uganda's parliament try to impeach President Museveni over serious accusations like corruption, genocide, etc.? Can the Ugandan oppositions bring to bear, pressure to bear, and impeach the president like the South Africans did in South Africa?
I think that question is a no-brainer. I mean, there's no way that the Ugandan parliament could probably do something like that because let's face it, you know, again, that when it comes to parliament or the legislature in Uganda has demonstrated quite clearly that it does not have the independence that it is required to have. It simply acts in terms of being subordinate to the executive, which is, of course, led by President Yoweri Museveni. We just saw it last year in December when there was this major issue of a constitutional amendment of removing the term limits and all that kind of stuff. Almost every public opinion poll that I saw suggested that more than 85% of the people in Uganda did not want that clause to be touched. They did not want any amendment that would allow President Yoweri Museveni to essentially actually become a sort of presidential monarch. So I don't think that the Ugandan government, frankly, the Ugandan parliament could do that because it just does not have power. It doesn't have power. Most of the members of parliament seem to be patriotic to their stomachs, having each of them been given $8,000 in order to vote in favor of Museveni's position and abdicating the responsibility of reflecting the concerns and the demands of their constituents. In fact, the last time I checked, I hear that most of these people cannot even go back to their constituents because they face having problems with the people who say, we sent you to parliament to represent us, but you don't.
Shaka, still in Uganda, let's go. We are getting a lot of reactions following up on last week's show where you hosted a remarkable young Ugandan, a member of parliament, by the names of Robert Chagulanyi, or aka Bobi Wine. People want to know your impression of him and what does it, can he aspire the next generation of young leaders in Uganda?
Well, first of all, let's face it, I found him to be an amazing force of nature. It's an amazing force of nature. He's very down to earth. He's a man who is very courageous, a man that is remarkably articulate, a man that is committed both in terms of using his art, in terms of music, and in terms of politics. He's a man, frankly, who has, I think, distinguished himself in such a very short time as an advocate of socio-economic justice for all of us. You know, in Uganda, the position of president or head of state is not really open. It has an individual who thinks that he has an exclusive right on it. In fact, he calls it ring fencing. So most people are not, for example, expected, for example, even to develop an appetite for such an office, even to dream or imagine that they can aspire to that office because it is only reserved for one particular individual. But let's face it, the fact of the matter is that Uganda is a republic the last time I checked. It is not a monarchy. So in that case, I think that Bobi Wine has clearly indicated that he does have or own the right, for example, to aspire to anything, including State House. And if he actually can continue the way he seems to be, you know, kind of like drawing traction and what have you, I don't see, frankly, what can stop him.
What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are looking at the political developments, transition and what have you in South Africa. Very briefly, of course, we are looking at the exit of Jacob Zuma from Union House in Pretoria. Mushorozi is out, and now the new kid on the block, of course, is Cyril Ramaphosa, a man, of course, somebody has written a book about him, and it said, a man who would be king. He's a very rich guy. He's one of the 20 richest guys in South Africa, having, of course, gotten the money through the ANC program, which was designed to essentially empower black people in terms of business. He did that very well. He also was a remarkable trade union leader who was a key negotiator, by the way, to end apartheid. And he had great respect and admiration from the Madiba himself. In fact, the Madiba had wanted Cyril to succeed him, except that he was vetoed by the ANC, which is made up largely of people who lived in exile for many, many, many years and seem to have a sense of entitlement as exiles. But I think with the emergence of Cyril Ramaphosa, it is a new ball game, really. It's a game changer, because this is the first time, for example, that you have an ANC leader who neither lived many years in exile or lived on Robben Island for very many years, meaning, of course, Nelson Mandela. So this is a new kid who did not go in exile, who was imprisoned for at least like a year. But for the most part, he was an activist, and he used democratic means in order to get where he is right now. And so a lot of expectations, but a lot of challenges, really. Can he actually, can he in fact do it? Can he become the new champion that he is expected to be? Time will tell.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Shaka. Once again, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
You're most welcome.
Yes, and we look forward to another interaction next week. And to you all, our viewers, thank you for sharing your comments with us today. And I will see you next week on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Bye for now.